Okay, let's finish up the axial skeleton and then move into the appendicular skeleton. Of course, when we say axial skeleton, we mean that part of the skeleton is pretty much down the middle of the body, and the appendicular skeleton are the appendages that basically connect to that. So we've been talking about the axial skeleton so far, especially the skull, and now we've talked about the vertebrae, and now we're getting down into what would be called the bony thorax region, which would include the sternum and the ribs. So let's look at the sternum first, and notice that it's divided up into parts. An upper area called a manubrium, the major part of the bone called the body, and the lower portion of the bone called the xiphoid process. And the manubrium actually has an area called a jugular notch at the top of it and a sternal angle which connects it to the body. So let's look at that. So here we have the whole sternum. Okay, notice we have the sternum right here. Okay, the upper portion, so I like to think of the sternum kind of being like a necktie, and the knot of the tie, the upper portion, is the manubrium, and the top of the manubrium has a little indentation in it, and it's called the jugular notch. The bottom of the manubrium, where it connects to the body, the major portion of the bone, is called the sternal angle. And you can probably feel both the jugular notch. Don't push too hard, but if you feel the top of your manubrium, there's a lot of nerves around that. It's a pretty sensitive area. And you also can feel that little, kind of a little ridge in the breastbone there, the whole sternum, kind of not too far away from the top. That is the sternal angle. Then we've got the body. Then we've got the bottom part that is pointed, and that is the xiphoid process. Now let's talk about the ribs. We said there were 12 thoracic vertebrae, and there are 12 pair of ribs. Now again, it's not a one-to-one connection, one rib per one vertebrae. Some ribs actually attach to more than one vertebrae. They overlap at those costal facets, but nonetheless, they do kind of match up, at least as far as the numbers are concerned. So when we look at those ribs, we'll notice that the first 7 are called true ribs, or vertebrosternal ribs, and they attach to the sternum, as it says, by their own costal cartilage. The next 5 pair are called false ribs, and they attach, as it says, indirectly to the sternum. And then out of those 5 pair, ribs 8 through 10 are called vertebrochondral, and ribs 11 and 12 are called floating ribs. So floating ribs are included in false ribs, but the false ribs also have pairs 8 through 10 that are not considered floating ribs. So let's look and see what we mean by that. So we can number our ribs from top to bottom, and we can the top rib would be rib 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So ribs 1 through 7 are all considered true ribs, and we can follow them to actual cartilage right here. This is hyaline cartilage, and it gives our whole thoracic cavity a little bit of flexibility. So, it's easier for this to move. Obviously, the thoracic cavity moving during breathing is extremely important. And if we were to take some sort of something hitting us, then it's a little bit better to bend than to break. Okay, so the first 7 are true ribs because we can follow the costal cartilage all the way from the rib directly to the sternum. Even when we get down here, I can still follow this to the sternum all the way to 7. I can follow from the rib directly to a piece of cartilage to the sternum. Now, the false ribs are going to be ribs 8 through 12. And notice that starting at rib 8, 9, and 10, 8, 9, and 10 all go to one common area of the cartilage. 8, 9, and 10 go to one common area of the cartilage. And then ribs 11 and 12 are called floating ribs because they don't attach to cartilage at all. So floating ribs, which are considered part of the false ribs, but since they don't attach to any cartilage, so they don't have any activity with the actual sternum, they're called floating ribs. False ribs don't have a one cartilage to one connection to the sternum, but instead these last 3 ribs here, 8, 9, and 10, they attach to a single piece of cartilage that then eventually attaches to the sternum. Well, that finishes up the axial skeleton. Now we're going to talk about the appendicular skeleton, the skeleton that kind of attaches to the axial skeleton. So we can see the axial skeleton that we just went over, all this that's kind of highlighted in a yellowish tone and running down the middle of the body. And we can see there were 80 bones included in that axial skeleton, and 22 of them came from the skull. So the rest of them then were the rest of the ribs and the vertebrae and the sacrum. So what we're going to look at now is the appendicular skeleton, which is all these bones to the side, which are attaching basically to the axial skeleton. And of course you've probably heard the term appendages, which is usually referring to some sort of like arm or leg-like structure. So the first part we're going to look at is the pectoral or shoulder girdle, which is not a bone, but it is a group of bones in a specific area. And so the first bone we're actually going to look at is the clavicle. And most of people call it their collarbone. So again, here we see actually the structure list of the appendicular skeleton. You can see the numbers of bones here, and again, most of them are duplicated. So it sounds like a big number of bones, but when you consider most of these are duplicated, some of these have several bones involved in them. So like the phalanges, the bones of the fingers, if you consider 28 bones of the fingers, but they're all separate bones, but they're very similar to each other. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. And I put an extra film up to help describe some of the area of the hand, which does a good job on that. So again, it may seem really intimidating with the number, but when you think about most of them are doubled, it's really not that bad. Now the clavicle here is really articulating with two different bones. It's articulating with both the sternum and the scapula. So it's articulating with an axial bone and another appendicular bone. All right, so if we have the clavicle here, now notice this clavicle has this bend in it, this natural bend in it, and it has a blunt end that is actually next to the sternum, so we call that the sternal end. And it's got a flatter, more curved area here that's next to the scapula, next to a specific part of the scapula called the acromion process, so it's called the acromial end. Okay, another thing that we have is here near this little bend going to the acromial end, we actually have something called a glenoid tubercle, a little sharp protrusion there. You can kind of see that sharp protrusion right through here a little bit, and that's always going to be near the acromial end, and it's always going to point downward. We should be able to look at this and basically tell if it's right or left according to, the curvature, the glenoid tubercle, the acromial end, and the sternal end. Now that's a little bit more difficult to do by looking at a two-dimensional than an actual three-dimensional, but I would expect you to be able to pick up a clavicle and tell me if it's right or left by knowing which end is the acromial end, which is the sternal end. The inferior end is always going to have the glenoid tubercle into it, and the curve is always going to point outward or to the anterior surface. Okay, the next appendicular bone would be the scapula. A lot of people call it their shoulder blades. We're going to look at these structures: the acromion process, coracoid process, subscapular notch, glenoid cavity, and spine. But then we're going to see that it has both borders and angles and fosses. So let's look at these structures first, then we'll talk about the borders, angles, and fosses. Okay, the anterior view would be looking from the front of the body. Of course, we'd have all these other bones in front of it. So this would actually be kind of deep in the body, even though it's still from the front side. Whereas this is from the posterior view, looking at it from the back side, which means it's more superficial. It's closer to the surface. So, when you're looking at somebody's back, or looking at this from the back perspective, this is going to be closer to the surface of the body, whereas this is going to be under a bunch of stuff. So this is going to be more superficial. This will be deeper or under something. That's why we use the term sub, which means under, to describe some of the things here. All right, so let's look at this. So we've got these protrusions coming off of here, and this big protrusion coming off on the more superficial but posterior side is the spine of the scapula. This area right through here is the spine of the scapula, and coming off the spine of the scapula, this front part right here, projecting forward, that it's going to articulate with the clavicle, is called the acromion process. Okay, so I've got the spine of the scapula here coming off of it, the acromion process, and then below it, or kind of in front and below it on this side, I can see the coracoid process. So we need to make sure we know the difference in the acromion process, which is actually going to articulate with the clavicle, and the coracoid process, which is going to be an attachment site for several muscles. Okay, this area right here, and specifically right here, if we turn it sideways, this is where the head of the humerus, your upper arm bone, fits into this. This is called the glenoid cavity. It can also be called the glenoid fossa. But this is actually where, if you've heard the term ball and socket joint, this is the socket of the ball and socket joint. So we always know it's going to be on the lateral side, because your arm doesn't come out of the middle of your back, it comes out of the side of this. So in this case, the arm would be fitting over here on the lateral, so this would be the medial side. Arm would be fitting over here on this one on the lateral, so this would be the medial side. Okay, so the glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa is the socket where the arm fits. And then we actually have this kind of notch found right in this area here. From our picture of models, we can see kind of the subscapular notch. It's kind of behind this area that we're looking at right here. So it's actually more right through here on the same side as the coracoid process. Now let's look at the borders and angles that we talked about. Of course, a border is a long area, and our borders basically have a good description to them. So I've got this area at the top, the superior part of it. Got the superior area at the top right through here on this portion. Of course, this is the posterior side of the scapula. This is the anterior side, but this is the superficial. This is the deeper side. Okay, so this top area here, this top area right through here, superior border. The border next to where the arm would fit in, there's our glenoid fossa right there. There's our glenoid fossa. So this area right here, remember our arms always fit in laterally. So that means this border right here, this border is our medial border, also referred to as the vertebral border, because it would be the one next to the vertebrae. So this would be more towards the middle of the back, Now there are angles that are also formed on where these borders come together. So the superior border basically is formed where the superior angle, is basically formed where the superior border is meeting the medial border. So right here or right here. The inferior angle is basically where the lateral border is meeting the medial border. So inferior angle right here and right here, medial border and lateral border. But the lateral angle is kind of where the lateral border meets the glenoid fossa. So that little point right there, where the lateral border and the glenoid fossa or glenoid cavity kind of come together. So you can see points and angle, points and angle, points and angle. So lateral angle, inferior angle, superior angle, medial border, lateral border, and superior border. So let's look at the fossas, which are these depressions here. And so notice sub means under. So even though this is the anterior view, remember this is lying underneath all that pectoral area. So if we're looking from the front part of the body, we'd have to look through a bunch of stuff. So the sub means it's underneath. And so here's our coracoid process, which is always on the front side. Here is the spine, and with the acromion process hanging off of it. So sub means underneath, so this kind of depression in this area underneath. Now this is the spine here, so we actually have a depression above it. Supra means above, spinous means we're referring to that, fossa is depression. Infra means below, spinous means we're referring to the spine right here, and fossa means depression. So these are the depressions found in the scapula.